Well, good afternoon. I'm John Sengenberger, and it's been my honor since 2001 to serve as the head of our Alumni Relations Office at the Tepper School of Business. We're so glad to have you with us today for our webinar on Gen AI implications on the business and the workforce. It's certainly a hot topic for all of our things here at the university, and certainly in society. This session will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared in the Tepper School website and the webinar page in the coming days. We'll also be open for questions in the later part of today's session, but you can enter questions anytime you have by using the QA box on your screen. We did receive an outstanding number of questions in advance, so I think we're all set. But before we begin our discussions, a couple of announcements. First of all, this is the first in a series on Gen AI with our faculty here. So we've got two more coming up in October and November, great on different aspects of AI with our faculty. So looking forward to those. Some of you have already signed up for those, which is great. We also want to alert you about our upcoming reunion. April 19th and 20th, 2024 will be our MBA, our master's reunion for the classes of 4s and 9s. It's also a one-year reunion for our recent grads. This will be a historic reunion for us, too. It's the 75th anniversary of the founding of GSIA, the business school, the Tepper School now, in 1949, and the 20th anniversary of the naming of the Tepper School in 2004. So very special one. We've got a great number of volunteers. If you want to volunteer for your class reunion, we'd love to have you join us as well. We also, the week before, we have Spring Carnival and Reunion Weekend for our undergraduate alumni. They're celebrating also their 4s and 9s and a one-year reunion for the class of 2023. So that'll be a special celebration, and we will be actively involved again with Spring Carnival and Reunion Weekend. So hope you'll mark your calendars now to join us. We also want you to know that Alumni Award nominations are now being accepted. We had a great group of Alumni Award recipients last year. We need more nominations from all of you, our alumni community. So now is the time to start to get those in. Our Alumni Awards Committee will be reviewing them later in the year, but we want to get those nominations in now. We also want to remind you that to make your annual gift online, it's your gifts, your support of the school that allows the outstanding academic mission of the university to continue in the Tepper School, and we need your support. It helps us also to provide great opportunities for our alumni like today. So thank you for all your support. Now, let me introduce our faculty who are going to be speaking today. I'm very excited to have Professor Ravi. He's the Andris Zoltners Professor of Business and Professor of Operations Research and Computer Science here at the Tepper School. He received his bachelor's degree from IIT in Madras and his master's and doctoral degrees from Brown University in computer science. He's one of the numerous computer science professors we have here teaching at the business school. He's been here since 1995. He served as Associate Dean for Intellectual Strategy, and he's also chair of the Future of Educational Delivery Committee that launched our very successful online hybrid Tepper MBA program in 2013. He currently serves as Director of Analytics Strategy for the school and leads the center for the new center that we'll talk about today for intelligent business. He's got a prolific author and a great scholar, so glad to have you with us, Ravi. Thank you for joining us today. Next, we have Professor Laurence, who was just promoted to a full professor here of economics at the Tepper School. He's also the Director of Undergraduate Research in Economics. He participates as a faculty member in the Block Center for Technology and Society, and also the Manufacturing Futures Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. It's part of our cross-campus collaboration that we're so proud of here at the university. He received his BS in physics from the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and then his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota, where he also was a research analyst for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He teaches emerging markets and global economics. He's been an award winner, as you'll see, both in the MBA world and undergrad. So he's been a great professor here at the school. And we're excited today to have these two outstanding professors talk about this very important topic. So let me hand it over to Professor Ravi, and he'll get started with our presentation today.
And good afternoon to all of you. Let me share my screen. And let's get started. First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming to this exciting series of webinars. My task today is to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes just setting the stage for the set of speakers that will follow. And so I thought it's good to start the story where data analytic technologies have been useful and have been serving businesses over the past couple of decades. As this picture shows, the original use of analytic models in business drew upon three primary types of technologies. I've loosely labeled them as those that allow us to do inference using ideas from statistics. As an example, I have the use of principal components to find factors of risk in a financial portfolio. And then we have prediction technologies, which come from computer science, namely AI, and in particular machine learning. And there we have applications of the type, what's the best cross-selling opportunity based on a customer's journey, say in marketing. And finally, we have planning technologies that come from operations research, where we have, for example, in operations, the optimal design of supply chain networks and decisions related to inventory and so on. So these are classic applications of data technologies and analytic technologies using that data to businesses, and these are very mature in the form of product portfolios and applications. Now, what I'd like to do next is set up what has happened in the last couple of years, which is generative AI. The key distinction between generative AI and regular machine learning or AI is that in traditional or regular machine learning, what we do is we have examples of data and outputs in the form of, say, labels that we'd like to learn. And we use a predictive model to help us understand for new data what its label might be. For example, I have a set of products in that marketing example, and I've seen traditionally people adopting new product recommendations, and I use that to figure out what's the best new product to cross-sell. In generative AI, what has happened is the input is no longer supervised like it was in the regular machine learning case in this picture. It is more of an unstructured input. And what the model does is to extract patterns that are inherent in that very large unstructured corpus of data. And the output is no longer a label, but it is actually new content of the same type as the one that was fed to these models. Let's take a look. One example of generative AI models that I'm sure you've all heard about is the text generation models like ChatGPT, the large language models. For these models, the unstructured corpus that comes in is text, and the output can be text again in the same ilk, sometimes used for summarization, question answering, translation. Or we can use the input, which is the text, to generate images or even audio, or sometimes even generate a small set of decisions. So you see, in this case, the output is no longer restricted to be very structured. It's more broader than what the model itself was trained on. Well, how do these models work? They try to learn the corpus of data, in the case of languages, the corpus of language data, by extracting patterns that exist in the language. And as you've no doubt heard, what they do is, given a large context of text, they simply try to predict what might come next plausibly using some probabilistic prediction models. So simplistically, that's what they do. But then how come they're so powerful? And here's where all the development in the last year or two really takes hold. Large language models have three distinctive properties about them. The first is that they are trained on really large amounts of data. This slide from the intro to Gen AI by Google Cloud Tech talks about billions of parameters, but actually now we are approaching the trillion parameter mark with some of these models. So they're really large. Secondly, they are pre-trained on a very large corpus of data to learn these weights. So when we talk of large language models, there is really a requirement to have a very large amount of input and computational power to be able to train these trillion parameters. And finally, there is a certain kind of technical architecture called the transformer architecture in neural networks that has come to be quite important in these models. I won't get into the details. The next webinar by Karan Singh will get into some of the details of transformer models. But when we put these generative abilities with the pre-training with a huge amount of data and the transformer architecture, we get a model where once you give it some input, like how's it going, it's able to generate a well-formed answer like I'm doing all right, thank you. So that's what a large language model is, a specific example of a generative AI model. And so the question before us today and in the future series of webinars is, where does it fit? What is the business use case? We had great use cases for inferential, predictive, and planning technologies. Now we have this generative technology. What use does it find in the usual process of business? Well, this is a good point for me to introduce the new Center for Intelligent Business. You find a link there, where our goal since the beginning of the year when we launched has been to try to use AI for IA, or intelligence augmentation, to make business managers better. And in the center over the summer, we launched a new thrust in Gen AI to answer precisely the question, what are the use cases of Gen AI in business? This thrust is led by Laurence, my colleague, who will be with you shortly. And this series of webinars that will continue will feature the different fellows from this inquiry. For the rest of today, Laurence will lay out the more general implications of Gen AI for business and to some extent society as a whole. And the following webinars will follow up on answering the question, what are the business use cases of Gen AI? So without further ado, let me give you Laurence.
And I want to start from what Ravi was mentioning by showing you what was launched today. We have under the Center for Intelligent Business, this new website on Gen AI. And I'm going to put the link in the chat. One thing of interest that you will find there is the first output that the fellow has prepared, having you alumni as an audience. We've released the first 3 guides on generative AI, focusing on business communication, entrepreneurship, and business analytics. If I just open the first one on business communication, this was Professor Dejeu, you will see that it goes a deep dive showing you what are potential application, what are the exciting frontier of usage, but also showcasing what are the potential concerns in using this type of technology. So the first 3 guides are online today, and you will be able to see the remaining within a week or so. Okay, so I'll continue from the introduction that Ravi started by having, as an economist, a bit my own economist perspective on Gen AI, both in terms of how to think about it and in terms of implication. And my first starting point is not actually to look at the technology, but look at the potential impact. When I teach future of work, we have an approach of decomposing what is a job by a lot of underlying categories. At the broadest level, I could think about a job, and you could think about it yourself, as a combination of 7 big blocks. For example, every job with different weights collects inputs, data process, administer, communicates, reasons, and then you perform either physical or intangible activities. Right. So a lot of these domains had already been infringed upon in terms of automation. Information input, data processing, those are well within the realm of automated areas. Physical tasks, clearly within the realm of automated tasks. Now what we see, and I highlight them here in red, we now have 2 more blocks that are infringed upon or being potentially automated, which is the communication and interaction and the intangible activities. So clearly now the domain of what are the tasks that are entirely within the scope of humans is shrinking a little bit, and we'll think about what are the implications of that. Now, this is very broad, so I want to kind of give you a bit of a deeper dive. A lot of the questions we received ahead of this webinar focus on what are the tasks, what are the jobs that might be automated. And the honest answer is, I don't know. Nobody does, but I can start having like an educated guess. And a work I've worked on in the last few years kind of starts giving a bit of a perspective on that. The work is actually titled after one of my favorite shows, How It's Made, and the claim is that any technology, whether an industrial robot, the assembly line, or ChatGPT, can ultimately be brought down to 3 ingredients. So 3 ingredients are very simple and manageable way to think about technology. And ultimately, we say that the 3 ingredients are: how is the technology enable me to split a task into subtasks? This is a bit of an obscure thing to think about, but if you think about the assembly line, that's the more obvious place where we had a task that originally was done by an artisan, that now we can break it down in very small subtasks. At the opposite end, if you think about additive manufacturing, you have a task that was done by many different welders, and now it's done by an entire machine. So the ability to split tasks is an important dimension of technology. The second one, here you start seeing already how ChatGPT might be at play, is a bit the trade-off that any operator have about speed and complexity. Clearly, ChatGPT and other large language model, and in general any generative AI, is now expanding the bandwidth in handling between speed and complexity. More complex tasks are at hand. Finally, and this is also the third ingredient, which is maybe less intuitive, is how quickly can a form of technology be retasked to do something else. Now, if you think about an industrial robot, when it's done with its tasks, it sits there, and I cannot ask that industrial robot to clean the floor. However, here you see where AI is a bit different, because AI can very quickly go from writing a poem to solving an optimization problem to writing my yearly report. Okay? So this is something that it's now something very different. When you put all of these together, and I promised John I wouldn't do any math today, but what you can prove is that naturally, depending on how the speed complexity trade-off comes about, you can think about automation hitting in what we call a cone of automation. The relevant space to think about where do we automate is not one-dimensional, but it's two-dimensional. The one dimension is obvious. On here on the axis, on the vertical axis, I have the length of a task. At the bottom, you have easy tasks. At the top, you have complicated tasks. So it's not surprising to say that, oh, we're going to kind of hit at the middle. Some tasks might be well beyond the scope of what a machine can do. It's too complex. The bottom is also interesting because here is not a question of feasibility. Can a machine that does a medium difficult task do an easy task? For sure. The question is, does it make economic and business sense to do it? And the answer many times is not. However, I want to talk about the second dimension, which is the scale of output. As you see, the cone starts automating at the middle, but then it grows. Here is where a lot of interest is in terms of AI, because one dimension that is really important is to think how big is the output that this machine will be asked to work on. If the output is very little, we'll be on the left-hand side. And actually, when output is very little, don't automate, just hire somebody to do it. However, as output grows larger and larger and larger, even the easy tasks, the economically not optimal ones to automate, become optimal to do so. This is problematic because as we move to more larger and larger volumes, even the easy tasks, the one in the domain of lower skilled workers, are now automated. If you want to remember this, think about, using Gen AI to write your emails. If you're sending one email a month, my dad complaining about something, well, then should he use Gen AI? No, write the email. Now, if I, for example, instead I'm writing 50 emails answering similar questions, well, now it becomes more to the right. It becomes more the domain of Gen AI. Now, at the moment, this has been a very broad theory, and it's not clear what is making Gen AI different, besides saying it's a more capable form of automation. And I've thought a bit about it, especially during the summer, on what makes Gen AI different. And the first picture that came to mind is a famous paper about GPT. Here, GPT is not what we associate with a large language model, but is by a general purpose technology. And this graph is from a paper, and it highlights how general purpose technology very quickly, quote unquote, become adopted by a large amount of people. Now, I want you to look at the axis here. What we're looking for is electrification, starting point, end of the 19th century, and IT, early 70s. Now, the scale, this is in years, meaning that for both these technologies, about 20 years after their starting point, let's say the 90s for the case of IT, were adopted by 20–30% of households. Now, you see here how we are now in a very different domain. I do not know how this diagram will look for Gen AI, but it's not going to be measured in years. This may be measured in months. And this brings about the first key difference, which is Gen AI is going to move really fast. Now, why is that? Why is that Gen AI is going to be adopted much quicker than any IT or internal combustion engine of the past? The answer that economists have thought about is it's intangible, right? You know, imagine we were doing the following. We were having a webinar 150 years ago about the hot new technology, which would be, I don't know, railways. Okay, so I would say how railways will transform logistics and everything. And then somebody would ask, how quickly will it do so? And then I will maybe see about how many the Philadelphia Steamworks, how many locomotives they can create. And we'll say like, well, they're creating 20 locomotives every 2–3 months, so we can do the math. Now, go back to think about ChatGPT, how quickly it reached 1 million or 1 billion users. That's a very different scale. You can scale up intangible capital very quickly. You don't have literally the law of physics applying to you. Now, this creates a variety of additional complications that my colleagues in finance will analyze in depth later on during the year, which is intangible capital can also be very volatile. I want to make you give this as a thought, which is now we all have these household names in terms of what is the most useful generative AI for text. Now, if tomorrow there was another entrant, how quickly would we switch from one firm to the other? Now, this is where things get tricky, because we could do as quickly as we signed up for OpenAI, we could quickly sign up for the next big thing. This is very different from physical capital. Think about how quickly can we switch from internal combustion to electric cars. Well, there we are again constrained by physical capital. We cannot all tomorrow switch to a car, even if we wanted to do so. Additional aspect which makes the study of intangible capital fascinating is spillover. At a basic level, tangible capital is exclusive. What do I mean by that is that if I'm using a locomotive, Ravi cannot use the locomotive I'm using. This is different when intangible capital. If we're talking about algorithms and data, we can both simultaneously use that same capital, which means that we could scale it up, or we could be doing different tasks with it. So we generate a lot of spillovers. Okay. So I want to start going more into depth into Gen AI. We've seen about intangible capital. And the next aspect I want to talk a little bit about is one pet peeve I have when I hear a lot of papers that are coming out talking about the capabilities of this technology. I'm mostly jealous about what great work these folks are doing, but I do see some limits. For example, over the last couple of weeks, there was like a really interesting, exciting paper about the capability of generative AI in the marketing and consultant space. And this is really interesting, but the limits that I see is that it talks more about feasibility as about what might happen. As a PhD economist, I'm required by law to use in every talk the word incentives and equilibrium. And I feel that they are also good to bring up now. Because, for example, as we saw earlier with that cone of automation, a key decision is it doesn't matter what the technology can do. It really is important on where does it make sense to use it. This is an incentive for firms. Now, for the purpose of generative AI, I want you to think about yourself. Most of you have used that as a technology, and already there you can start thinking about what are your incentives to use it. This is not only a statement about should I use it or not, but how you're using it is also interesting. At a basic level, you could use that as a tool. I see it in two ways. One, will I use this tool to save time, or will I keep the same time investment and improve on quality? Go back to that email example. If you're sending an email, are you going to use this generative AI to just make a task that would take 5 minutes down to 1? Or are you going to generate many examples of an email, polish it, and really send a high quality email? Now, you see here that this is a complicated trade-off on time versus quality that economists naturally think about, and I'm going to show you something a little bit about that. The second aspect is something that some of you have asked. The word model collapse is coming about within the domain of computer science. What that means is literally if I retrain the generative AI on the output it created, what happens over time? Now, in the actuality, the discussion is a bit more complex. And what we're feeding the AI is the output, not of the AI itself, but there is a human in the loop. Let me show you a diagram to make the point a bit more clearly. Again, no math, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Think about as a state of the world, the universe of quality of tokens. If it helps, you could think about poems. There are many excellent poems out there. There are many not so great poems out there too. And that creates a nice distribution. Now, I could train an AI on the existing corpus of poems. It will learn from Shakespeare, and it will learn from my own limericks. Now, what happens over time? The human is, at any given stage, thinking about whether to use the AI or not. If it doesn't use the AI, then it's going to simply contribute to the next generation of data. And for example, it's natural to think that current poets may not be tempted to use Gen AI, but may go about writing their poetry books and submit that to future data trained. But most of us might submit and use the Gen AI and create data. Now, here it gets complicated, because remember I said earlier about that the inherent trade-off. How exactly are we using this AI? Are we using this AI to just create a lot of output fast, or are we using this AI to constantly polish and create a really high quality output? Now, we talked about poems, but maybe I could bring it a bit more home. I am an academic. I write papers. What should I do? Should I write hundreds of low-quality papers, or use all of these tools to write one truly groundbreaking papers? Now, clearly, academia provides rewards, so that the latter is what we try to do. But inherently, this opens up what will people use this GI for. Now, this is ongoing works with colleagues here at CMU. And what we're trying at the end to do is see how rewards shape incentives. Again, to anybody who has studied some economics, which is most of people in the audience, it's no surprise that prices drive a lot of human behavior. So here is where prices really are important. Let me go back to the example of me writing my academic output. The rewards that I have, I don't get paid for the papers, but there are rewards in terms of my salary and my career. In academia, rewards are very convex. If you create a lot of mediocre output, you get nothing. If you write one true groundbreaking paper, you get a lot. So very convex returns. Now, what we find is that when rewards are really convex, workers are incentivized to go for quality. This is good. This means that generative AI will lift the current distribution of quality of output out there and bring it up. However, in most scenarios, the rewards are kind of flat. Think about the email. If you send an okay email versus an exceptional email, the rewards are pretty much the same. Now, when rewards are flat, then we have a problem. I call the problem AI idiocracy. This is like a nudge to the famous Idiocracy movie. But if rewards are flat, now we might start seeing the large creation of mediocre output. This is problematic because we don't only today have mediocre output, but as we go forward in time, the Gen AI might be trained on a lot of pre-existing output and a lot of new mediocre output, thus lowering. So that might be an extreme case, but one where we progressively have worse and worse output being created. All right, I'm gonna spend maybe a few more minutes. And as I was preparing for this webinar and just thinking about this new technology, I kind of listed 3 things that I'm worried about. And a lot of the issues are going to be greatly expanded by the fellows that are going to think about the limitation of Gen AI in each domain of business. Now, the first one is something that if you studied econometrics, it should be kind of familiar. A challenge that this technology has is overfitting. Ravi mentioned the trillion parameters. The race there is to make the output created by the machine as close as possible to training data. Now, there is an inherent problem here, which is the moment you go and try to locally match better and better your model to data, you might create issues out of sample. Many overfitting examples exist about that. So this is inherent in this approach, which is kind of jeopardizing global accuracy in sake of local precision. The other one is something that economists have confronted and something that we have as a bane of our existence, which is the following, which is we are asked to make statements about what might happen next in a variety of scenarios, whether policy or technology, and we are to use data generated in the past. So a natural problem here, and as some of you also pointed this out in the question we received, is that there is a bit of backloading in data. How informative is data generated in the past for questions and that may be asked in the future? This can have a variety of flavor, from biases being introduced, but also relative in terms of being up to date in terms of what we are truly asking the AI. Challenge number 2. This is something that I've started to appreciate more working with engineers here at CMU, which is sometimes technological development is measured on the improved reliability and accuracy. This is something of great importance in a variety of industrial settings, but also in something we encounter in our everyday life. I want you to think about most of you might use Excel, and Excel is very reliable. You can ask Excel a question, and the answer you will get, without doubt, will always be the same. And chances are it's also very accurate. Now, this is a bit different because generative AI has inherent, and one can control of it, stochasticity to it. The output being generated has a form of uncertainty. I was joking with Ravi the other day on, imagine I come up with a new programming language that it's 100 times faster than current existing frontier. But there is a catch. Sometimes it makes stuff up. Now, this programming language, where will it be used? Will we be using it on planes? it's like, oh, well, we would appreciate the saving powers. Would we use it in cars? Definitely would be nice to have a compact computing unit working the autonomous driving, but how much are we willing to tolerate mistakes? Now, the place where we are willing to tolerate mistakes, let's go back to the example of me sending an email, is also the place where it's least likely to have great benefits. So this is a sense of a problem, which is machines, a key advantage they have over humans is that not only that they're fast, but they are fast with high reliable output. This is when generative AI is slightly different. Final, again, this maybe it's my training as an economist, which is something that an alum and Nobel Prize winner of Tepper once said at Prescott, progress, don't regress. And the idea there was theory is important. Theory is important because it provides a coherent framework to understand what's happening. Machine learning based AI, I think, faces a challenge, which is a lot of the findings are not theory based, and it's unclear that theory can have a role, but are simulation and trial and error based. The problem with simulation and trial and error is, again, going back to my trust question before, how many simulations do we have to do until we trust the output? I like to think about planes and autopilots. We could simulate a machine learning based autopilot system for a plane. However, we will always have a doubt, is there something that we are missing in the simulation? Will there be a combination of events that will make the plane flip over? Now, generative AI has not been used on planes. My understanding that at the core, most of these autopilot systems have theory. There is a mathematical model that ultimately is a model, an aerodynamic model of the plane, and the computer acts on that. Now, of course, the model can be imperfect, but at least in the places that we understand the model, the output is very predictable. All right, I'll have 2 more slides and then we go to Q&A. And as an Italian, I have this as a slide to introduce my next topic. A few years back, there was a lot of interest in industrial robots. If you remember, robots were coming for every single job out there, including, and I stole this picture from, I think it was an NBC website, about this company that was promising to do pizzas with a robot. Now, this goes back a bit on the should. Can an industrial robot make a pizza? It's like, sure. Should it? No. If you Google it up, this company went, I don't know if it went bankrupt or it never took off. This raises a problem, which is, if I think about an industrial robot and everything it can do, making it put pizzas in the oven is not very creative. And here is where, when I look at the discussion about generative AI, I also see a kind of lack of creativity. This is a point that's in a slightly different way Asimoglu and Johnson are also doing in their latest book. But if you think about, whenever you hear generative AI, a lot of the benchmarking is relative to humans. A radiologist gets this right 80 times, generative AI gets it right 90 times per out of 100. This human benchmarking is potentially misguided because it kind of limits the creativity on what we can do with this technology. As an example, I like to think about the following. When we discovered and perfected portable power, we didn't go into making steam-powered humanoids that would move boxes in warehouses. We thought about adding wheels to it and adding wings to it. Clearly, the moment I think about a plane, comparison with a human is silly. How much better is a plane than a human at doing a task? I don't even know how to answer that. Now, the challenge that I have, and this maybe is a challenge that I leave for all of our audience too, as business leaders, is when we think about generative AI, if we stop thinking about it as a mimicry of human, what are the equivalent of wheels and wings for generative AI? I think this is an important aspect, because if we keep pushing generative AI as a replacement of a human, eventually we might succeed in replacing humans in many tasks. And that clearly is detrimental for society. It's also detrimental for businesses. If we figure out a new technology that saves us 10% of costs, sure, we'll adopt that technology, but what are the productivity benefits of it? they're probably minuscule. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at this, just as a recap of what we are, 3 keywords we did today. First, the cone of automation. Where are we likely to see automation take place? Roughly in the middle skill tasks. This is something we hear a lot. What we bring to the table is that's kind of incomplete. There is a big caveat there. It depends on output. As larger the output, larger is the range of tasks that should be or could be automated. Second is how is the difference between an AI and a robot? Well, intangible, that's the key word. That's going to change a lot in terms of speed of adoption, externalities, and so on. Finally, this rewards, bringing incentives a bit into this conversation. How prices shape behavior will determine what will happen over time. Will this technology lift us towards higher quality output for all, or will we be swamped by mediocre output generated in the pursuit of saving time? Again, prices will drive that. Okay, I'm going to end up here. We've received many questions, so I'll maybe leave the floor to John, and we can scooch both over here.
Well, great. Thank you very much. That was a great introduction to it. And I will ask a couple of questions that came from our audience in advance, and I'm sure our audience is going to jump in with some other questions as well. I know that the future webinar programs might address some of the other ones more specifically, but for today, let's follow up on what we already have here. So, Laurence, let me start with you first. Long term, as more and more AI-generated text becomes available and gets pulled in as training data for the large language models, how can model collapse be prevented and accurate responses be encouraged?
No, it's we touched a little bit about that, and clearly there is where the policymaker, might have a voice. Economists have a few roles for policymaker. One is externalities. If I flood the internet with low quality output, this is not only a problem for my own rewards, but I might be literally polluting future training. So this is something that has not been yet at the domain of policymaker thinking, but encouraging and preventing that might soon be a scope. Going back to the reward, there is ensuring that rewards are at the very least increasing in quality. As a society, can we decide, or as a firms, decide to reward quality more? The more convex the reward for quality, the less likely will be the ensue of idiocracy. That can be done by firms, their own policies, their own internal reward systems. It could be done by policymakers. I study taxes a lot, and I'm already thinking about how taxes can make rewards a bit more convex for everyone.
Great, thank you. Ravi, let's go to you. What advantages will Gen AI and these large language models offer to incumbent businesses versus startups? I think that's a big question. We have a big startup community in the Carnegie Mellon ecosystem. They're thinking all about it. I know every startup is talking about it. We just had a webinar panel talking about startups and AI offered down in our New York alumni chapter. But what are your perspectives on it from incumbent businesses?
Thank you, John. If I go back to the framing I had in my very beginning about generative AI as being a new generative technology, then I asked myself, what are the business tasks that I can map directly to the capabilities of generative AI? And mapping your question to that, will it be possible for an incumbent versus a startup firm to be able to address that mapping better? And I think the answer here is mixed, but I think it weighs more on to the advantage of the startups, as in each of the earlier waves of technology advantages. It's simply because startups can be agile enough to target an area like summarization, like new drug discovery, like discovering patterns from engine failures from sensors. These are very specialized activities that startups can, in an agile way, develop a tool for from Gen AI. And in fact, all the buzz that you see in the startup community around Gen AI is of that nature. Now, that being said, the big advantage to the incumbent firms is resources, because even though each of us can sign into a free ChatGPT account or the $20 for the premium account, actually bringing up a company based on a special corpus of data on which the Gen AI model is trained requires substantial amount of resources. So startups now have to turn to partnerships with these large language model manufacturers, and that's much easier for an incumbent to do with deep pockets. So I'll leave it at that, two sides.
Yeah, let me ask a follow-up question to that from one of our alumni. Do you see a significant short-term gap developing for small businesses to compete with the efficiencies AI can generate compared to large businesses? So versus the startups, but the smaller businesses that are trying to get into the field.
Yes, I do think that there are several reasons for that. One is the resource requirement that I mentioned. The second is the fact that for Gen AI and in general AI to be useful, you require a lot of very useful data, historical data that has information. And that's an advantage that is slightly harder for startups to come by as well. So yes, I do agree with that sentiment.
Okay. Laurence, coming to you. Gen AI has been around for more than 15 years, and we talk about AI in general being almost born here at Carnegie Mellon and so many other great universities. What has changed to make now this ignore at your own peril? If you would respond on that.
I first like a bit of a clarification, like whether AI is, goes back a little bit. Generative AI, we're talking about a couple of years. So this is, with the introduction of transformer models, that's something a bit more recent. Why now? Well, I would say, let's go back thinking about that intangible nature. Any adoption will be extremely convex. And when you're, this is something that, in optimal control systems, when you have things that change at a convex speed, the earlier you get on it, the better it is. And we seems to be exactly at an inflection point. So this is something that, of course, we will see if it's sustainable. But I would think that now, given this convex growth, is something that we should keep a close eye on.
Yeah, I think there's a question about how much of this is hype and how much is something that is practically going to be applicable to businesses. I think that's probably what the Center for Intelligent Business is going to decide.
That's right. And I would like to say, look, if this is going to be relegated as, we found a way to save on payroll by 10-20%, this is it's gonna be present, but it's not gonna be as transformative. I want to give and think back about the wheels and the wings. If if somebody figures out how to attach wings to it, this is gonna be have large impact.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit to that too, John. So how much of this is hype versus how much is a real value? Clearly, like Laurence mentioned early on, there are areas where we won't be deploying it, like in a autopilot in a flight. But there are areas where involving generating text, translating, summarization, new product discovery, where the ability to scour through huge volumes of data and find interesting patterns to highlight is the bulk of the work. And I was reading the most recent issue of The Economist, which talks about literature-based discovery in science. And that's a clear example of where Gen AI's ability to scour through a large amount of scientific literature and find potential collaborators and potential new leads for problems to work on in science, right, is a clear new advantage. So I think we can't answer this in one fell swoop, right? We have to consider the mode of application.
John, I scanned, there are a couple of questions I can pick up from the chat before, sorry to jump in. Jamie is asking, will there be webinars on the other functional areas? And absolutely. We have 2 of them already scheduled. Karan is going to talk on October 25th about a bit more on the technical sides of generative AI. Professor Dejeux in November 13th is going to talk about business communication, and we are in the process of scheduling also the other functional areas. I'll just take maybe another one I see here. Zach is asking, nice to see you, Zach. The study about economic impact of generative AI. And the point he's making is very astute, which is like, oh, we always think about the one side, technology substituting certain workers. He's also bringing about, well, what about people who will make this technology and make sure it works? The short answer is there is very little on overall economic impact. And I would almost warn people not to put too much weight on any report out there on total economic impact for a couple of reasons. The first one is that we usually tend to think about these impacts keeping everything fixed, meaning what would happen if we substitute this fraction of workers? That surely can happen, but that's very limited. What is hard to predict, again, I go back to the wheels and the wings, is what additional tasks might be created, not only be relative to what Zach is thinking about, who is going to run these systems, but what else can we do with these systems that is not even in the domain. Now, if I could predict this, I tell my students, I drive a minivan. If I was able to accurately predict this, I would be flying in with my plane, and I would not be in the business of predicting. I would be in the business of making it. So,
Great. Thank you. Ravi, how will AI be limited in highly regulated industries like healthcare?
Great question. I think this relates to Laurence's point about stochasticity, if you remember. The fact that AI, Gen AI in particular, and some other models in regular AI like neural networks are somewhat inexplicable, makes their use very limited in fields where regulation requires you to come up with an explanation. This is also related to a question I saw from Tommy in the chat about explainability. So it's all really related to what are the requirements in the regulation about the nature of the technology that's being deployed. And I think that will clearly limit its use in recommending procedures that are risky, in guiding equipment that are high risk. For example, nuclear power regulation, plant regulation. I think that would be a place where people would tread very lightly with AI, and also very rare and important disaster prevention, things like earthquake prediction, disaster prevention. I think people will tread quite lightly. So the answer is it's related to the stochasticity and the inexplainability, and what that implies in being able to fulfill the regulatory requirements of answering what the results are from, where the results are from.
Hans asked a question related to it. Is there a risk for people not to share their quality outputs to train the AI models? Several news suggests that some authors or experts are declining their products or outright suing OpenAI to be used in AI due to copyright issues, internal security issues, and things like that. How does that speak to the future of generative AI?
Yeah, this reminds me, like Ravi and I had a project that we started thinking a couple of years ago about how do we reward the workers who are contributing to data. We don't have a good answer to that, right? Usually, in Econ 101, we have this idea that if you marginal contribution to an output is, $1, eventually the market will reward you $1. Now, with generative AI, there is a bit of a problem, and this is also connected to explainability and connected to the lack of theory, which is if I'm an author and I'm submitting a novel to that training of generative AI, how much am I contributing to the output that will be contributed, that will be generated? Now, the authors who are defending their intellectual property, they're probably under the correct interpretation that, I'm sure it's greater than zero. I'm currently getting zero for helping train this AI. I think it's greater than zero, but how much is it? That's where we do not know. So this is something that we don't have a theoretical framework or a policy framework to start thinking about how to go about it. One approach, and this is something that Ravi and I were thinking about, is like, well, maybe this is why there should be a mandate for a minimum form of income. Meaning, if we ultimately cannot trace what's the contribution, maybe we all get a check, irrespective of what we do. So that could be, it's still TBD, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, if there is an incentive for you not to contribute, I guess there are other ways of using the very proprietary and useful data, which is by, forking off your own copy of the general pre-trained model and then doing the extra bit of training with your proprietary data. And this is one of the solutions that I've seen advocated by many of the startups in such a situation. But I think Laurence's point is really, when is there an incentive for someone with useful proprietary data to contribute to training a Gen AI? Right? And unless that question is well answered, I don't think you will see very interesting answers to the price of data question. Yeah.
All right. Well, how can we best position ourselves with a technology that is rapidly improving, changing, and hard to predict what the next innovation will be?
Oh, this is tricky, right? It's I could take that in a couple of ways. One is like how an entrepreneur might position and how a worker might position. The challenge for, I'll think about maybe the worker. The challenge there is that the time horizon is very different. And this is a challenge that we've seen not only for technology, but even for trade. Traditionally, we're able to adapt the workforce because changes in the environment are measured in human scale. Okay, if I would tell you, okay, in 20, 30 years, this thing is going to go about, maybe it's not you, but maybe we'll tell our kids to go in that direction. Trade is a great example of that. But when the changes happen in a couple of years, this is an inherent problem. This is not consistent with ways in which we go about training people in general. Usually we think about you're gonna spend 20 plus years of training and then you go out and work. But what if the change happen in a couple of years? That model is clearly limited. Clearly this is a bigger issue than what the author of the question had in mind, but in positioning worker, we ultimately go back to even educational policies, and that's slow moving.
And that comes into the question we got, what career should my 8-year-old son think about now?
It's a great question. I think, your 8-year-old also speak to my 8-year-old because career choices is not something on the radar. But giving something concrete, I would think about, the speed of changes is gonna only go up. Okay, so any type of training, any type of learning that's kind of like fosters agility, it can be multi-purpose applied to different settings. I think that's probably a good idea. Probably a narrow specialization, a narrow focus early on. That's tricky, right? It could be lucky and be rewarded. You could be going into typewriter maintenance at the wrong time. So anyway.
So as an Italian, you're saying that our kids should all be playing soccer, right, or football?
Oh, that's definitely true.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today. Maybe one last question for you, Ravi, is what does the Center for Intelligent Business do, and how can they help our alumni as they address these issues?
Yeah, thank you for the prompt, John, and I appreciate it. The center has been started to bring problems that industries face, not just in Gen AI, but in deploying AI in general, to our faculty and our PhD students. So one of the things we do in the center quite frequently is on Friday mornings, we have a coffee chat where we bring in firms talking about problems that they encounter that they're trying to solve now. And we have a healthy interaction with our faculty and PhD students in trying to frame those problems and to see how they can be somehow converted into longer-term studies. The other thing that our center does in engaging with alumni like yourselves is we try to channel some of the short-term projects you have into capstones for our many programs, like the Masters in Business Analytics, product management, our MBA tracks, as well as some undergraduate products. So this is another area where we have engaged quite productively. And last but not least, we have some activities such as workshops and hackathons, one-off speaking engagements that we sponsor in classes and in clubs related to AI and analytics. So these are all different ways in which you can engage. And if you simply want to just get in touch with us and talk to us about your growth with data in your business, we're also very happy to engage in that way. So we look forward to that.
Great. Thank you both. We appreciate your leadership in this area at the Tepper School and your collaboration across campus at Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you to all our alumni and guests for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next month on our next webinar series or at one of our in-person alumni events around the country and around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today.